everybody, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I'm going to be recommending you a book for every prompt on the Bookoplathon board. So if you guys are unaware of what the Bookoplathon is, it is a 1 month long readathon that is happening across the entirety of the month of September that is based on my TBR game Becca's Bookopoly. So you have a printable Bookopoly board and you roll 2 dice, move around the board, and you have to pick a book for every prompt that you land on. I'm obviously not going to be going into the specifics of the readathon here today, so I will link the announcement video up here and down in my description box for you guys to check out if you would like to participate. There are printables, there's like a Discord community, there's merch and a whole ton of like fun stuff, and everything will be explained to you in that announcement video if this is the first time you're stumbling across Bookopoly. So there are in total 40 spaces on the Bookoplathon board, but today I'm going to be recommending you 29 books because there are some prompts that I just can't really recommend you a book for. So I think the prompts that we're going to be skipping today are all of the chance on the community shelf spaces, because that's obviously very dependent on what you guys choose to include in your stacks. I'm also going to be skipping 2 of the corner spaces, which is the go randomize your TBR space, because my recommendation is going to help you because I don't know what's on your TBR, and I will also be skipping out the TBR game space. And then I think the last 2 that I'm skipping is the poll pick and the mood read, because once again those ones are very dependent on you guys. I have chosen to recommend a book for the prompts that require you to use a random generator. Obviously the things that I generate to then pick a book are going to be different from the things that you guys generate, but my kind of thinking with this is that not only would I be able to recommend books that might fit some of the prompts, because the thing with the Bookoplathon as well is that I intentionally make it so that it's very dependent on the individual that's participating as opposed to the board. So a lot of prompts on the board require you to refer to your own libraries, your own collections, your own TBR, as opposed to being a very concrete kind of specific prompt. But there is a space on the board that is Becca Rec, and I know I have a whole ton of recommendation videos for you guys to go through, but I thought that I would make this video as well. So not only am I recommending for the individual prompts, giving you guys some ideas maybe, I'm also giving you a whole ton of Becca Recs that you can pick from if you do land on that space. Now this was very daunting when I got this stack of books out. There are actually 2 stacks next to me. One of them is as high as my knee, so it comes up to just under the camera from the floor, and the next one is about half the size of that. But when I got them together, this is 29 of my most favorite books of all time, and just seeing them all together makes me really happy, especially because I read some of them quite a while ago, so my memory is not as fresh on them. If anybody's interested in what I'm drinking today as well, this is the violet cream tea from Bird and Blend, so it's like chocolate and violet flavored. It is so good. I've gotten really into tea, and Bird and Blend tea specifically recently. It's a black tea, this one, and I'm drinking it out of course the Bookoplathon mug. Don't judge the straw as well. I don't like drinks to touch my teeth where possible. So we are kicking off with not the first space on the board, because as I said I'm not recommending a book for the go space, but the space adjacent to that, and the prompt for that is lowest rated. So for this I went to my Goodreads, I organized it by average rating, and I picked the book with the lowest average rating that I had given either a 4 or a 5-star rating to, and it still bugs me. This is the book with the 4th lowest average rating that I've read, and it is one of my favorites. That is The Furies by Katie Lowe. It's a thriller, but it's very atmospheric, and it has a very slight witchy element in here as well. And it's following this group of girls who go to this, I don't think it's a boarding school, I think it's a private school, but the main character's father has died, and with the money from like the insurance, and I think it was an accident, so with the money from the accident, the main character's mother has paid for her to go to this private school where she meets this very enigmatic group of girls and desperately wants to be friends with them. The way that this story starts off is actually with the discovery of a dead body at a park. So from the very beginning we know that one of the girls in this story, either from the group or the main character, are dead, but we don't know how they end up like that. So this is actually told from the main character being like in her 30s, and she's looking back on when she attended this school and when she was friends with these girls, and it is the events that build up to the eventual death of one of them. So this book actually contains something that I don't usually like, and it's when you question whether things are real, like that witchy element that I was talking about. Is it legit, or is it just the effect of these girls kind of being wrapped up in each other that makes them believe that things are happening that aren't actually happening. The way I like to describe this book is that it's like The Craft but British. It's set in the 90s, has that witchy element, also has this very like close-knit but kind of toxic female friendship group in here, and there is also content warnings for sexual assault in here as well. I was obsessed with this book. I think I read it in like 2 sittings, but apparently I'm the only one. The next space is Community Shelf, which we are obviously skipping, and we will be moving on to a short book. So this is a short book that I really love that I read recently. It is 118 pages, so it is small, and that is A Supplicant by Sierra Simone. This is a very small adult romance novella about a woman who was about to marry her college professor. They'd met before the start of term, didn't know that she was going to be in his class. They had a little bit of a fling and then quickly found out that she was his student. However, that didn't stop them. They fell madly in love. He proposed, they were going to be married, and he abandoned her on the day of their wedding. Like, he left her at the altar. So this is set, I think it is 5 years in the future, and the main character had grand plans for herself and her education and what she wanted to do afterwards. However, with her professor leaving her at the altar and also some things going on in her family, she has had to give up college and her dreams to be able to pay rent and also support her younger brother. One of her jobs is that she's working as a server for a catering company, and this catering company just happened to be catering an event that Church Carson is attending, and their relationship kind of starts up again. The thing that I love the most about this is that it is so melodramatic. Like, it has a touch of academia because of like the student professor taboo kind of relationship, and also the fact that they're into like archaeology and religious iconography and all of that kind of stuff. So the language that they use and the way they describe their love for each other, it is so dramatic, which is, I'm not reading romance for reality, I'm reading romance for the drama and the angst, and this definitely provided it with this very kind of like extravagant description. So if you want a very short, quick, smutty, dramatic, angsty read, would definitely recommend Supplicant. I am going to stack these on here, but only for a little while because it won't be long until the table starts to collapse. I am going to be skipping TBR Veteran and moving on to the first of the train stations, which is Spring, and all of the train stations are just books that remind you of the season that is on the station. So for Spring, I've chosen Heartstopper because Spring for me is like contemporary, new beginnings, very light-hearted, like sweet reads, and Heartstopper is a bind-up of a webcomic. We all know there's a Netflix show. I love the Netflix show, by the way. It gave me all of the feelings that the comic does, but this is a bind-up of a webcomic by Alice Oseman, and it is the kind of story that I can only appreciate if it is in a graphic format, because I don't read young adult contemporary, it's not my thing. And this is very simply the story of 2 boys, one's 15, one's 16, one's openly gay, one doesn't know that he may have feelings for boys at all until he meets the other, and it's just their love story. It does have some hard-hitting topics throughout the series, including like eating disorders and anxiety and depression. There's no drama in their relationship because the point of this is not that. Like, it's nothing to do with drama, there's no angst, I'm pretty sure there's not going to be any third act breakup. It's just their relationship, and it is the sweetest, most wholesome thing that I've ever read. And if it was in any other format, like if it was a standardly formatted book, I would have absolutely no interest in it, but in this I just find it to be absolutely precious. So definitely like a read that's reminiscent of Spring for me. Next up we are on to the light blues / purples, and these are all like elements on the cover. So the first one is People, and for that I had to recommend my favorite book of all time, okay, which is House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J Maas. I have a ton of content on this, so I will link something up above. I have so many videos on this book, so if you want to know like my true feelings on this, then you can go check out all of that content. But this is an adult fantasy romance following a half-fae woman called Bryce, who is tasked by the Archangel of Crescent City with investigating a string of murders. Because it's very dangerous, she is assigned a bodyguard in the form of the fallen angel Hunt Athalar, and the reason why she's been chosen is that she actually has a personal connection to these murders. They thought that they'd actually already caught the person responsible, however people have started to turn up dead again. This is a book about trauma and recovery. It's about grief and healing, and I love this book so much. The sequel is not it, but this first book makes me feel all of the emotions. I've actually reread it this year and it hit even harder the second time around. So yeah, I think that this one is a masterpiece. I don't love the sequel, but book 1, phenomenal. For a book with like a text or a pattern or both on the cover, I have chosen Jade City by Fonda Lee, but when I selected this for this prompt, I had the standard cover in mind, which I will pop a picture of here, not this one, which is the Illumicrate special edition. Jade City is an adult urban fantasy that is set on the island of Caicon, where they mine jade, and the Kekanese actually have the ability to harness the powers that jade can give some people, including like enhanced strength, like better perception, dexterity, and that kind of thing. This is obviously something that the rest of the world also wants to be able to harness, because the Kekanese have a massive advantage, even though they don't really have a military presence or anything, but it is something that the rest of the world kind of wants to weaponize. So on the island of Caicon, there are two major gangs that pretty much control the jade supply, and they have very different opinions on how they want the rest of the world to be able to access jade. So the majority of this story is about a war between these two clans, starting off with some very minor offenses and building in severity until there's pretty much like no doubt in anyone's mind that these clans are going to go to war. And as we progress throughout the series, it's very political, and the politics get more and more international and wider scale as we go along. It is a slow one, but I will say that the audiobook is phenomenal if you are an audiobook listener. I will say that I prefer the plot in the first one, and I prefer the characters the further we get into it, so that I lose interest in the plot as the series goes on, but I grow more attached to the characters. But if you're somebody who likes like fantasy with a very small close-knit cast of characters and with a whole ton of politics and like kind of hypotheticals and critiques on the real world, then this might be a series that you're interested in. For a book that has buildings on the cover, I have Savage Lands by Stacey Murray Brown. This has a whole ton of smoke and light text on there, but the only thing aside from that on here is buildings. But this one is a post-apocalyptic feeling fantasy romance that is set in Budapest after the wall between the world of the Fae and the humans has fallen. Our main character was actually born at the moment that the veil fell, and she is the daughter of a general who's been taken in as the ward of the king. From her position of privilege, she tries to help out the lower classes by stealing contraband and drugs from trains that transport them throughout the city and putting those drugs back onto the black market so that the profits get into the hands of the people that need them, as opposed to the elite. And one day when she's doing this, she's caught and she's thrown into this maximum security prison where she meets this really sexy guy who looks like Jason Momoa called Warwick Farkas. These are not the best books I've ever read, but they are very addictive if you like a very fast-paced, like juicy fantasy romance that you just can't really put down. Would definitely recommend Savage Lands. Moving on to one of the corner spaces, which is Dice Roll Roulette. I did roll for this so I could give you a recommendation. I rolled a 6. Which meant that I had to pick a book between 275 and 324 pages. This one is 297, which I actually thought it was longer than this, and it is one of my favorite fantasy romances of all time, Fortuna Swan by KJ Sutton. So this one is a fairy romance following a young woman called Fortuna who is a nightmare, which means that she has the ability to sense people's fears and make them feel like they are experiencing them. Her brother is also a nightmare, and he has been missing for the last 2 years, and Fortuna has been searching for him, but pretty much to no avail. One day when she's pretty much given up hope, she is approached by a very powerful fairy male who says that not only does he know where her brother is, he will take her to him providing that she marries him. This one is super angsty, multiple love interests. We have a true love triangle in here where everybody in the triangle has been involved with each other at some point in time. This one is also super dark as well, big content warnings for sexual assault in here, and also like torture, slavery, that kind of thing. And if you're looking for like a smutty fantasy romance, this isn't the smuttiest to start off with. It like slowly creeps in throughout the length of the series. For the first of the pinks, which is a book that is either published or set before 1999, I had 2 for this because I just couldn't pick one. But the first one is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This one is the, oh my god, what is it called? The Folio Society edition. Rebecca is my favorite classic of all time. I will admit that the only reason I read it, like the reason I was drawn to it, is because of my name. But this is such a creepy atmospheric book that kind of like sucks you in and doesn't let you go. I also really like the Hitchcock movie of this as well, if you're looking for like an old black and white one. I haven't watched the new one and I actually probably won't. But this is following a young woman who's kind of on holiday. She works as like an assistant to this older lady, or like a caretaker. But while she's on holiday with this lady, she meets the like alluring and handsome bachelor, Max de Winter. They very quickly fall in love and get married, and he takes her back to his home, which is a manor house in England called Mandalay, where the main character is very much trying to settle in, but she feels very overshadowed by the ghost of Max's ex-wife, Rebecca. So it's a little bit of a ghost story, a little bit of a haunted house story. It's also like a romantic suspense thriller, super atmospheric, perfect for the fall season, my favorite classic of all time. And then the other one that I just had to recommend, because I just couldn't make this video without putting this book into it, but that is obviously Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, which is the first book in the realm of the Earthlings. This one is an adult fantasy following a young boy called Fitz. You all know the spiel by now, but it's following a young boy called Fitz who at the age of 6 is dumped on the doorstep of the keep by his maternal grandfather, who wants him to go back to his father. So Fitz is transported to his father, but by the time he arrives at the seat of the crown, his father has abdicated the throne and moved to the countryside, so this leaves Fitz in an awkward position where nobody really knows what to do with him. So he's pretty much raised by the stable Master Burrich up until he comes of an age where the king starts to take an interest in him and starts training him to become the royal assassin. Very slow moving atmospheric fantasy, one of my favorite fantasy universes of all time, because it is like 16 books overall broken up into smaller series. Also a very good atmospheric fall read, and it is very sad though. There is like sad animal stuff throughout all of the books, also lots of trauma, torture, and just generally people being terrible to poor old Fitz. For a book published between 2000 and 2019, I thought I'd give you one that's actually really good for a readathon, which is Dreaming Some by Ichigo Takano. This one is once again a contemporary story in a graphic format, because that's something that I really seem to enjoy, and this one has a little bit of a wild synopsis. It's about a girl whose father has remarried and had a new baby, so she's feeling very pushed out of her home, and she decides that she's gonna leave. So she packs her bags, leaves home, and stumbles across this drunk guy in the park who says that she can come and live with him providing that she fulfills 3 requirements. The first one is that she tells him why she ran away, the second is that she finds his missing house key, and the third is that she has a dream and falls in love. It's a very creepy premise to this series, but she ends up moving into this house where there are 2 guys living there who are actually around her age, and also the landlord, who's the one who was passed out in the park. And it's kind of like a young adult version of New Girl, where she has a crush on one of the boys there and she's like trying to get his attention while other stuff's going on. It's really funny, it's really sweet, really heartwarming. It does have some problematic elements, as a lot of manga does, things like fat phobia, but I really love this story. For a book published since 2020, I have Blood Trials by N.E. Davenport. This one is a 2022 release, so I pretty much went with the most recent release that I'd enjoyed. And this one is an adult sci-fi fantasy following a girl called Ikenna whose grandfather has been murdered. She's set up essentially to become one of these like elite warriors, but she's actually planning on taking a year off to deal with her grief and the death of her grandfather. She was actually like a very high up member in this society. However, there are people who think that he doesn't deserve his position and that Ikenna shouldn't be one of these elite warriors because they're both black. So one day her grandfather's closest advisor mentions to her that they think that her grandfather was actually murdered, and they have a strong suspicion that one of the guys who's leading the gladiatorial war games that allows you to become an elite warrior is responsible. So Ikenna decides that she's going to participate in the war games and get close to the guy who killed her grandfather so that she can kill him. If you're a fan of either Red Rising or Rage of Dragons, I think you'll really enjoy this. It's very brutal and very gory. Content warnings for all of that stuff, like torture, also racism. This is a very racist and sexist society, but it has a lot of the like high action, high stakes and drama that I really love from series like Red Rising, but also like a lot of the angst and impulsivity of YA series that I've loved. There's also a little bit of an enemies to lovers set up in here, which is something that I really enjoy. There's definitely areas that where it could have been better. I think that it could have been more fleshed out and there could have been like less going on in terms of plot and like more going on in terms of character development, but it was definitely a very good time and I'm really excited to read the sequel. The next space is summer, and summer for for me is 100% romance season, so I'm going to be recommending Get Alive Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert, which is the first book in a contemporary romance series that follows each of the Brown sisters. So this is following Chloe, who lives with chronic pain, and she tailors her life to kind of make her life as easy as possible for herself and never really pushes herself outside of her comfort zone. So after a near-death experience, she actually decides that she's going to kind of challenge her own boundaries and actually start living her life. So she moves out into this apartment building where the caretaker is a guy called Red, and they have like an instant dislike for each other that eventually obviously blossoms into something a little bit more romantic. The thing that I love about this is the writing style and the humor. If you were a fan of the Georgia Nicholson series when you were a teenager, this is Georgia Nicholson for adults, with the way that the characters speak, interact with each other, the kind of humor. It's kind of just like absurd and a little bit ridiculous, but in like a more natural way. The only way that I can kind of get the point across about what the writing style and the humor is like is if you have read the Georgia Nicholson series. But yeah, I definitely didn't expect to love this as much as I did, and it's one of my favorite romance series. Next up we have The Oranges, or The Favorites. So the first one is a book with your favorite trope, and one of my favorite tropes is definitely enemies to lovers. So of course I'm going to be recommending to you guys The Hating Game by Sally Thorne. This one is an adult contemporary office romance following two people who have the same job. They're like the assistants for two of the CEOs of this company that used to be two separate companies and has merged together. They're both publishers, but one of the companies thinks of literature as an art form and the other one thinks of it as just like a way to make money, and these two are very representative of the people that they work for. So they spend all of their days sat at desks facing each other, finding ways to piss each other off. So they stare at each other to try and get the other one to blink, and all sorts of petty things like that. However, one day these CEOs announced that they are going to be introducing a new position into the company, which is a step above Josh and Lucy. So they both be ideal candidates for it, but there's only one position. So they both agree that whichever one of them gets it, the other one's going to resign because they couldn't stand to work for each other. Sexual tension is amazing. Plot twists that I didn't see coming. I'm in love with Joshua Templeman. One of my favorite books ever. For a book with my favorite setting, this was really hard, but I really like kind of like medieval fantasy style books. So like no technology, swords and horses kind of situation, but following royalty, or like set in a royal court with like the politics and like the gorgeous gowns and the drama and the backstabbing. So one that has that castle setting and that royal court setting is The Queen of the Tearling by Erica Johansson. This is a sci-fi fantasy series actually, but it's following this girl called Kelsey who is the heir to the throne, and the story starts I think on her 16th birthday, which is when it is time for her to take the throne. So her mother sent her away because she feared that she was going to be assassinated, and her mother herself was actually assassinated and her uncle has been sitting as regent. So it's time for Kelsey to take over the throne, and she arrives at the kingdom and finds out that her uncle has actually been selling her people into slavery to pacify the evil queen of a neighboring kingdom. So Kelsey puts a stop to that straight away, putting her kingdom at odds with the neighboring kingdom of Montmesnay, and her kingdom is just not doing very well. They have no military presence, they have no money, and they have to find a way to survive against this evil queen who is very quickly going to invade. I really want to reread this series actually now that I'm thinking about it. I loved it, and the last book is very divisive, but I think it worked. I think it's the only way that the series could have come together. There is a prequel to this as well that I still haven't read, but I'm also very excited to get to. For a book that is my favorite genre, you may have noticed now, but that is fantasy. So for this, I'm going to be recommending Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This one is a high fantasy series that is very lyrical, very beautifully written, very atmospheric, and it is following this guy called Laszlo Strange who is obsessed with this city called Weep. Nobody knows if this city exists because one day it was just wiped from the minds of anybody who'd ever heard of it, and nobody could remember what it was called, so they just call it Weep. Laszlo would love to go to the city, but literally nobody remembers anything about it anymore, but Laszlo is sure that the city does exist. So one day a group of people come through I think it's a library where Laszlo works, and they say that they're going to the city of Weep and they want people to take with them. So Laszlo very quickly joins up and heads to the lost city of Weep to find out what happened to it and why it was wiped from everyone's memory. There is a romance in here, which, I mean, in case you also haven't guessed, my second favorite genre is romance. There is content warnings for like child abuse, torture, genocide throughout this duology, but it is a very creative, atmospheric, beautifully written series set in a very, like, it feels like a tangible world. Like, Laini Taylor has beautiful description, which means that like when you read this book you can kind of feel it at the same time. Moving on to the Reds, aka the random generators, I had a lot of fun generating the things that I needed for these books, but the first one is emoji, and the emoji that I generated is one I've never seen before. It is a little square that says free in it, so this took some thinking, but I'm going to be recommending the Plated Prisoner series by Raven Kennedy, the first book being Guild. This one is an adult fantasy romance following a young woman called Auron who has been gold touched by King Midas. He keeps her in a cage in his gilded palace, and Auron actually doesn't mind this because when she was younger her parents died and she actually suffered a lot of abuse at the hands of just people, just lots and lots of people, up until the point where she found Midas and he kind of took her in, because he isn't actually royalty by birth. He married into royalty and he brought Auron with him, but while they were both on the streets together he protected her, so she doesn't mind that she has this lack of freedom because of how her life was before she had this life with Midas. Content warnings in here for sexual assault, big content warnings for abuse, and also your general blood, gore and torture. But such a interesting story in that when you go into this you expect it to be a certain way and it isn't. It just really isn't, and I just love that about it. I still haven't read book 4 and I very much need to. The next one was a random letter generator. The letter I generated was L, and for that one I'm recommending The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. You can choose to include the and a or take them out when you're doing the letter generator. But this one is the first book in a sci-fi series that is a series of companion novels. The thing that I really love about Becky Chambers is that while she writes sci-fi, she focuses on contemporary societal issues and presents them in a sci-fi setting in a way that I really like. So this one is about the crew of a ship called the Wayfarer, and their job is to build tunnels through space, essentially so that you can fold the points in space and travel through them quickly instead of like traveling the traditional way, which would take potentially years. So they just get by on minor jobs. They're doing all right, but one day they're offered the job of a lifetime that will make them rich, but it is potentially very dangerous. So this is about the crew. It's about the found family of the crew and them as people, their relationships with each other and their identities, with a little bit of a plot. So it's definitely more of a character driven novel. But what I really like about Becky Chambers is that she makes you look at our society a certain way because of the way that she presents futuristic societies, and she presents things that people think is weird as completely normal in here, which makes you question why it's something that people would view as weird, because it's not. If that makes, you have to read it to understand what I'm saying, but if you like a character driven story then this may be one for you. And if you're a contemporary reader that doesn't read fantasy or sci-fi, I think that this might be one for you as well. The next one was Colour Wheel, and the colour that was picked for me was black, which I'm not mad about, and for that I'm going to be recommending another one of my favourite fantasy romances, which is Rhapsodic by Laura Thalassa. This one is an adult fairy romance about a woman who has a string of hundreds of black beads that winds all the way up her arm, and every bead represents a debt that she owes to the bargainer. Now the bargainer is this big bad fairy guy who's known for always collecting his debts, and it's unusual to have more than one bargain outstanding with the bargainer, yet somehow our main character Callie has hundreds. Now she actually hasn't seen the bargainer for 7 years, but she knows at some point that he's going to come back and collect on his debts. This one is definitely for fans of things like ACOTAR, especially like the second book, A Court of Mist and Fury, Desmond Flynn, Sexiest Man Alive, and if you are pretty new to fantasy romance, I'd probably recommend picking up this one. There is once again content warnings for sexual assault and domestic abuse in here, but I would say that it plays like a relatively minor part of the story as opposed to Plated Prisoner, where it's like quite a big theme. For autumn I decided to go with my favourite thriller, which is You by Caroline Kepnes. I love this series. So this has also been made into a Netflix show, which I do prefer the books, but I really like Penn Badgley's portrayal of Joe Goldberg. But this is following a guy called Joe who seems amazing. Like, he's really sweet, he's attentive, he's nice, he's like a soft nerdy boy, but he's also a stalker. So this is about Joe, who works in a bookstore, and a girl called Beck comes into his bookstore and he very quickly becomes infatuated with her and starts to stalk her. And there's many unique things about this. One is that it's told in second person, so it's like you got on the train, you went out for dinner, you got undressed, as like Joe is stalking Beck. And also, one of my favorite things, like why this is one of my favorite books ever, is that because you are in the mind of Joe, you see him rationalize everything he's doing. So you identify with Joe, you're rooting for Joe, like you want him to succeed, you want happiness for him. And when people are upsetting him, like you're mad on his behalf. And I really love that Caroline Kepnes like puts you into this very uncomfortable perspective and makes you identify with and feel for the person who is definitely in the wrong in this story. For a book that features a romance, I'd like to recommend one of my favorite middle grades, but it's a book that can be enjoyed by people of all ages, and that is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. This one is following a young woman called Sophie, who I think works in a hat shop, and she's cursed by a witch that turns her into an old lady. So she decides, I think, that she's gonna kind of go make a life for herself, gets up, just walks into the hills, and she discovers Howl's Moving Castle, which is owned by the mysterious wizard Howl. Now, this is a little bit of an eccentric story. It does have some romance in there. It has a contemporary element that I didn't expect, that like kind of brings the story to Wales in the UK. But I just love the charismatic and enigmatic Howl, and I love the way that this story, it's just whimsy. Whimsy is not something that I really love, but sometimes it really works for me, and Howl's Moving Castle to me feels like a very comforting fairy tale kind of read. So if you want something a little bit whimsical with a touch of romance and adventure and magic, would definitely recommend giving this one a go. And it is intended for a middle grade audience as well, so it's a pretty easy read. For a book that features a mystery, I'm actually surprised at how much I struggled with this one, but I ended up going with Orange by Ichigo Takano, which is once again a manga series, a contemporary manga series, and this one is about a young girl who receives a letter from her future self telling her that there is going to be a new boy joining her class, and that her and her group of friends have to watch over him and just be a good friend to him, because if they don't, then he is no longer going to be around at the point that they are at, like where this letter is coming from. So the mystery in here, I guess, is like, is the letter legit? Is it actually from the future? And who is this boy and what's going to happen? And why is it so important that the main character and her friends treat him well? I will say that in terms of a Western lens, this series doesn't treat mental health in the best way, in that it makes like your mental health dependent on the people around you when you're on mental health, and the way you deal with that is very much like, while you need a support system and a support system is helpful, ultimately it is on yourself to rectify that. But that is obviously just looking at this from a Western lens, not an Eastern lens, which is where the story is told from. But this is once again just a really sweet, heartwarming, emotional, tear-jerking manga, which, like I said multiple times throughout here, this is my favorite format to kind of experience this story in. This also has a love triangle, and I love the love triangle in here. One of the best ones I've ever read. And the final one for the yellows is a book that features a death. So of course I needed somewhere to put this series in. That is the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown. So this one is, it's a sci-fi fantasy, I'm gonna say, because it has a sci-fi setting with a dystopian overall plot, but like reads like a martial fantasy. But in this one we are following a young man called Darrow. I think he's about 16 right at the start, but he ages up to like 20 very quickly. But he is a red in this society that is broken down into colour. So we have reds right at the bottom and golds right at the top. And the responsibility of the reds is to mine for a valuable substance called helium-3. The reason they think that they're doing it is so that the solar system can be terraformed and that people can escape the dying planet Earth. However, after Darrow's wife makes herself a martyr to spur Darrow into action, he goes to the surface of the planet Mars and finds out that the planets have been terraformed for a long, long time, and the Reds are essentially being kept in slavery. So Darrow then joins a rebellion and plans to infiltrate the Golds and break them apart from the inside. So much drama, so much angst. I will say, if you're reading this first book and you're not feeling it, don't DNF it. get all the way through it because I was very confused and not really enjoying it until halfway through. Gave this first book 4 stars, and the second book is one of my favorite books of all time, and I really loved book 3 as well. But a lot of Shakespearean drama, a lot of people declaring duels, a lot of like big dramatic betrayals, and characters that do bad things to further good causes, like lots of great morality in here. One of my favorite series of all time. Okay, we are finally moving around to the last side of the board with the next prompt being Becca Rec. Now obviously all of the books in this video are a Becca Rec, but I decided to just pick a book that I didn't fit into any other prompt that I really love, just to give you a bonus one, and that one is Scythe by Neil Shusterman. This one is a young adult utopian that is set in a world where nobody dies, so there's no disease anymore, you can't die of old age, you can't even be like murdered or run over or anything. But obviously because of this there is a population problem, so to solve this we have the Scythes, and these are a group of people who are trained to glean people, aka kill them. So this is the story of Citra and Rowan, who are 2 apprentice scythes, and every scythe kind of has like their own way of killing. So Citra and Rowan are being trained. Meanwhile there's a lot of political stuff going on. As you can imagine, in a system like this there's a lot of room for corruption, and there is a lot of discussion about like whether people should be allowed to have the power to decide whether others live or die. Really loved this, very fast paced. I absolutely adored the world. I was a little disappointed in the last book in this series, but overall one of my favorite series of all time. Moving on to the greens, these are all perspectives, and the first one is a book in first person perspective, and I actually really struggled. I was picking up loads of books that I like and I couldn't find anything in first person, so I'm afraid I had to go with a really obvious one, which is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas. Also of course known as ACOTAR. This is the story of Feyre Archeron, who is responsible for feeding her family because they're all useless essentially, and one day in the middle of winter when she's hunting for food she accidentally kills a Fey shifter who is in the shape of a wolf, and the High Lord of Spring comes to claim her life in place of the life that she took. So she moves to his manor house and she has to live out the rest of her days there, but she very quickly realizes that things aren't quite what they seem in spring, as there is actually a blight upon the land and she may be able to break it. One of my favorite series of all time. I don't even need to tell you what this is about, to be honest. My first fantasy romance book, outside of, if you don't count paranormal romance as a form of fantasy romance, because obviously that was popular before this was my first fantasy romance and the reason why I am who I am today. For a book in third person, I have My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. This one is an adult horror, and this is quite simply about a girl whose best friend is possessed. So they go to, I think they go to someone's summer house and they go skinny dipping, and something happens, and after that event one of the girls isn't quite the same, and the main character has her suspicions about her best friend but she isn't quite sure, and throughout the course of this book things get more and more horrific. This is set in the 80s, which is one of the reasons why I really love it, because I love the 80s in terms of it being like an aesthetic, and the titles in here are song titles of like classic 80s songs. It was just a real good time. Content warnings for sad animal stuff and really disgusting horror stuff in here as well, but I really like Grady Hendrix, or the books that I've read from them so far at least. The final one for the greens is a multi-POV book, so I'm going to be recommending a book that I've just finished, which is Dual Perspective, and that is Her Soul to Take by Harley LaRue. This one was one of my Patreon picks, and it's a Kindle Unlimited book, and I didn't expect to love it as much as I did. I gave this 5 stars. This is I'm gonna say it's a fantasy romance. It has a lot of paranormal vibes, but it is surrounding a god and demons, so I personally would say it's fantasy as opposed to paranormal. But it's following this young woman who moves back to the town that her family's from to finish attending university after her parents have retired to Spain, and there's a lot of superstitions surrounding this town and a mining accident where 40 miners got trapped in the mines and only 3 resurfaced, and they'd actually been eating all of the people who were down there with them. So she actually has this YouTube channel where she carries out paranormal investigations, and she's trying to make content for that and like boost her audience. So she decides to do this like shock clickbaity demon summoning, and actually summons a demon called Leon. Leon has to be summoned by using this grimoire, and he's previously been in service to this like big wealthy family who are actually sacrificing people to this god in the mines to try and raise it. So the good guides of this story, I guess, are trying to stop that from happening, while the main character is being targeted as a sacrifice. So this is very kinky. Would recommend looking up the list of kinks on Goodreads if like kind of kinky smut is not something that you're into. I didn't think I would love it, but it turns out that I actually really did. It was a really good time. It is like kind of monster romancy as well, because the guy's a demon and he does have some differences, but it's more of a case of like he's 90% man, 10% monster in like anatomy, shall we say. But something that I really loved about this is that the atmosphere reminded me a lot of like the 2010 YA paranormal, like Hush Hush, the Twilight series, in the setting and the atmosphere, but obviously a lot more adult. So I had these nostalgic feelings for the setting and the atmosphere, and then the smut and the romance was amazing, and the plot was decent as well. The next phase is winter, and something that is very wintry for me is like childhood favorites or like comforting reads and things that have like a certain kind of atmosphere about them. So for this book doesn't have a cover. It's Nevermore by Jessica Townsend. It's a middle grade book. Didn't get into this when the first print of the hardback was around, so I ordered this off eBay and it came without a dust jacket. But this is the first book in a middle grade series following a girl called Morrigan Crow, who is a cursed child, and she is actually destined to die on, I think it's her 12th birthday. But in her town they have this bidding day where people from the town essentially take on apprentices, and because Morrigan's going to die, she doesn't expect anyone to bid on her. However, she does actually get quite a few offers, one of which is from Jupiter North, who swoops Morrigan away to the magical city of Nevermore and enters her into a series of trials that will give her entry into the Wondrous Society, which is kind of a magic school, but they have like apprenticeships and stuff as well. It is one of those middle grade books where you can find value in it no matter your age. I love the setting. I love how this world feels tangible. Like Jessica Townsend has made Nevermore seem like it's a place that you could visit if only you knew how to access it, and I just found it to be very imaginative and very immersive in everything that like I kind of want from a children's story as an adult. Like it's one of those where it hits the points for children but also has so many more levels to it that you can only kind of really appreciate when you're a little bit older. For the dark blues, the first prompt is big book. So for this one, I'm recommending a book that's not necessarily ideal for a readathon, because the way that I've done this is that I'm recommending the biggest book that I've read and enjoyed that isn't a sequel, and this is kind of a sequel. It's Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb. It's the first book in the Live Ship Traders, but in terms of the Realm of the Eldlings, it is book 4. You know, you can technically read these on their own. You don't have to read the Farseers trilogy to read this, but there is things in here that you won't get if you haven't read the Farseer trilogy, and it won't ruin your enjoyment of this series. It's like you're not missing anything if you haven't read the Farseer trilogy, but you are gaining stuff if you have. But this is a multi-perspective adult fantasy series that surrounds these live ships. So when 3 generations of a family have died on the decks of these ships, they actually come to life. And it's beneficial to have a live ship because you can work in harmony with your ship to move faster, evade pirates, and travel to places where normal ships are unable to pass. So in this one, we are mainly following the Vestrit family, and the youngest daughter, Althea, always thought that she was going to inherit the ship. However, as her father is dying on the deck of the ship, he changes his mind at the very last minute and he gives the ship to his son-in-law, which is Althea's brother-in-law, instead of Althea. So then Althea sets off on a mission to try and get her ship back. There's more in here. There's like small town politics. There's a lot more about the magic of the Realm of the Eldlings than you find in the Fitz books. And this is actually, I think, the last series, which I'm currently reading, may turn out to be my favorite trilogy in the Realm of the Eldlings, but at the minute this one is my favorite trilogy in the Realm of the Eldlings. The character development in this series is superb. For most recent purchase, I went with the most recent book that I've acquired, read, and enjoyed, which is Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson. This was the adult fairy loot book for June, I think. And this one is a contemporary fantasy that is following this group of witches who were friends when they were children, so they still have connections because of that. It was back in the 90s when they were like 10 years old, but since a war between the witches and the warlocks of the world, they've kind of gone their separate ways, but they still have like these threads that hold them together. So the catalyst of this story is that there is a prophecy prophecy that says that this demon is going to rise, and the precursor for that is going to be the arrival of the sullied child. So Helena, who is one of these women and is now the high priestess of Her Majesty's Royal Coven, thinks that she's found the sullied child, but the sullied child will not communicate with anyone. So Helena recruits the help of her childhood friend Neve to take this child in and try and communicate with them and get them to open up, to essentially stop them from becoming the sullied child so that this demon never rises. I really enjoyed this. It's set in the north of England, so it has a lot of like Yorkshire things about it, including like the dialect. And then the seat of power for Her Majesty's Royal Coven is Manchester, which is where I'm from. And so I really loved that about it. I loved the 90s and early 2000s references in here. I really loved the eclectic mix in this friendship group and how it very much reflects reality, in that like how you can grow so far apart from people while still like maintaining the same kind of roots, if that makes sense, and that same commonality and like common thread that holds you together. And yeah, I really love this one. I'm really excited for the sequel. I didn't expect to enjoy this as much as I did, but considering Juno Dawson doesn't really write fantasy, I really enjoyed it. And the final prompt finally is highest rated. So for this, I once again sorted all of the books that I'd read by average rating, and I'm recommending you guys the highest rated book that isn't a sequel, which is really obvious because when you organize your Goodreads books by highest rated and you're a fantasy reader, you're always going to come up with the Stormlight Archive. So this is Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. Now I'm recommending this with the caveat of like, personally, I would not recommend that you start reading Brandon Sanderson with the Stormlight Archive. In terms of Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, you can read all of the series separately, but this one is the one that ties the Cosmere together. So in terms of reading order, I would recommend that you just read everything else before Stormlight. But for the purpose of this prompt, I mean, all of the books in this series were my highest average ratings. So the Stormlight Archive is a very interesting adult fantasy in that the characters are completely ignorant to the world around them. So this takes place after the assassination of a king at a peace treaty meeting. So these two species, shall we say, one is human, were meeting to negotiate a peace, and one side assassinated the king of the other. So since then these people have been at war, and it's kind of it's never ending essentially. None of them are really gaining an advantage. So we're following like one of the generals who was the brother of the king. We're following somebody who is becoming the apprentice to I think it's the daughter of the king who was assassinated. But everything is pretty much to do with this war. However, it's actually about a mysterious creatures called Spren. It's about shard blades, it's about historical knights that lived thousands of years ago, but none of the characters kind of acknowledge the strangeness of the magic system they live in, and you're kind of puzzling it out as you go through. It very much reads, because it's very war focused, like a swords and horses kind of war, up until you get further into the series and you learn more and more about the magic system, and it becomes like this. Just Brandon Sanderson's brain has so much scope, and the details and the plotting, and honestly would just recommend Sanderson because he is a master storyteller. I think that he has characters that you root for. He has really interesting immersive plots and worlds. For me, his genius is in the way that he constructs his narrative and how every single thing is relevant. And the thing that I love about him is that you will not see his reveals coming, but when they're revealed, you will be able to think back and pinpoint every single time that he laid a clue for you to find that led up to this plot point. And they're so obvious that it's kind of like if you knew what you were looking for, it's obvious, but he just redirects you every time he brings up a plot point. So the things that you're focusing on aren't the important parts of the plot, it's everything else going on around it. And then just to top it all off, just as I reach the end of this video, my battery died, but those were 29, I think, recommendations for almost every space on the Bookoplathon board. So I hope that if you were struggling for maybe a Becca Rec, or you wanted some recommendations for any particular prompt, or you wanted, with the ones that are open for interpretation, maybe you wanted a different perspective or take on the prompt that you hadn't thought of yet. I hope this has helped you in some way, but this is a long video, and I know that I can't be brief, so I knew it was going to be. But I've actually enjoyed talking about books that I love, that some of them I haven't spoken about in quite some time, and just seeing so many books that I'm obsessed with in one place is really something, because it's been like a long time since I've told you guys about like Heartstopper or Chloe Brown or Nevermore, and it was really great to revisit some of those older favorites today. So yeah, please let me know down in the comments if any of these recommendations were helpful for you. Also, maybe drop some recommendations of your own for any prompts that maybe you think that people might be finding difficult. I do hope that those of you who are participating in the Bookoplathon have a great time, and I hope that maybe some of you guys who just watched this for the recommendations maybe go ahead and check out the Bookoplathon and consider joining us, because it's really a fun time. You can tailor it however you want to read as little or as much as you want to make it easy or challenging. It's really just a readathon to have fun with no competitive element at all, and if you are competing with anyone, it's literally just yourself. But that is it from me today, guys, so please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. That's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.